Welcome to the Baptist Reformation, where we do the work of recovering the Reformation in Baptist thought. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, one and all, to the Baptist Reformation. Hold on, let me turn down my volume. It always does this little notification thing, and it's really annoying. Okay. All right, how's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing well. Some exciting things coming down the pipeline. I don't have time to discuss them now, but hopefully there will be a commercial on YouTube about it that I will share around Facebook that'll kind of tell you guys the lowdown, what's going on, what we're getting ready to put out, so on and so forth. But we are here talking about God's decree, and we're in paragraph 2 of chapter 3 of God's decree. So it's a short paragraph, but there's a lot there to be discussed, and there's some implications as well that I would like to talk about this morning. We're going to try to do better than last time, because last week, if you noticed, I kind of cut myself off. That's because for some reason my camera will only record, and I have a good-sized memory stick in there, but it'll only record to like 29 minutes. That's the limit. It's a setting. I got to fix it. I don't know how. I'm kind of a noob when it comes to this stuff. But yeah, I cut myself off, so it wasn't that great. I didn't like that. I didn't like doing that. So this time I'm going to try to get through everything within a considerable, a reasonable amount of time. Hopefully we won't go too far over, because 29 minutes is my cutoff. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and read the paragraph, and we'll get right into it. By the way, this is the copy. If you guys are just now joining us, I would encourage you, first of all, to go back and watch from the beginning. But also, we are using the Baptist Confession of Faith, the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, obviously. That's our confession. But we're using this edition. It's the only one that really looks like this. There's a leather cover. There's also a hardcover and a paperback. You can get on Solid Ground Books. Just search it in Google, Solid Ground Books, or solid-ground-books.com. Ran by a brother in Christ, a fellow Reformed Baptist, Mike Gadosh. He does great work over there, and this is the best edition of the Confession, because it comes with James Renahan's foreword. It comes with the letter to the reader, the original letter to the reader, and it has the catechism. So, yeah, it's a good one. I'd encourage you to pick it up and go through it with us. Anyways, here's the paragraph. Second paragraph of chapter 3. Although God knoweth whatsoever may or can come to pass upon all supposed conditions, yet hath he not decreed anything, because he foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions. Okay. Now, there's some interesting things to talk about there, obviously, but first of all, we have to begin with the fact that God's decree is not based on what we might call a passive foreknowledge. It's not based on what we might call a passive foreknowledge. Coffee. You gotta have that. Breakfast of champions, right? So it's not based on a passive foreknowledge. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by passive foreknowledge? A passive foreknowledge would be knowledge which only takes in that which the intellect observes, right? So a passive foreknowledge would be like a prophet has passive foreknowledge. This knowledge is given to him by God. It's not knowledge that originates in him, that originates in himself. It's a foreknowledge that the prophet sees by virtue of a God-given dream, a vision, or just direct audible revelation from God, or a meeting with an angel, or something like that. That's foreknowledge that's given to the prophet passively. In other words, it's given to the prophet. The prophet's, it's not something the prophet is doing in and of himself. He has received this knowledge, and that's what I'm talking about when I mean passive foreknowledge. God doesn't just it's not as if creation is its own thing and God merely looks forward and sees what will happen, kind of like an oracle might, or the ancient oracles might, or a fortune teller might try to do, or something like that. God's not just merely able to look forward and see what's going to happen in creation, as if creation is sort of its own mechanism doing whatever it wants to do, and then God can just merely look forward and see what it's going to do. That's not the kind of foreknowledge that God has. That would be passive foreknowledge. Passive foreknowledge is contingent. It's dependent on what the creature is going to do, right? Because if God had passive foreknowledge, he would just be looking forward in time to see what the creature will do, okay? And then would be taking in that information. And that's not the kind of knowledge God has. God's not dependent on the creature to be who he is. God's not dependent on the creature to know what he knows, if that makes sense. So passive foreknowledge is contingent foreknowledge, being dependent on things rather than originating in the divine essence. That's what passive foreknowledge is. And there's nothing that God has, so to speak, that does not originate in him, because then God would be something other than God. God would have a part of himself that is not God, and so he would be dependent on not God in order to be God, if that makes sense. So God does not have passive foreknowledge. So I want to rule that out at the very beginning. So there's no passive foreknowledge in God, because God is not contingent, okay? And we can go to Acts 15. Acts 15, verses 16 through 18. Let's see here. Acts 15, verses 16 through 18. And he's quoting, I believe, Amos. He says this. He says, "After this I will return and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down. And I will build it again, the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world." So his works, that's God's works, what God does is known by God. So what God does is grounded in God. And what God knows is grounded in God. And so there's no knowledge that's dependent ontologically on creatures or anything like that. Second, God knows what can happen should it be decreed. Excuse me. Goodness gracious. Coffee. God knows what can happen should it be decreed. So it says this in the paragraph. It says, "Although God knoweth whatsoever may or can come to pass upon all supposed conditions, yet hath he not decreed anything, because he foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions." So God knows what can happen. Let's just call these possibilities. God knows all possibilities exhaustively. But here's the thing. God knows these things not just because they're possible, inherent in creation. He knows these things because he knows himself. Okay? God's knowing of all possible futures, all right? We could call it possible futures. That's what I believe Aquinas uses that term, futures. Yet God's knowing of all possible futures happens by virtue of him knowing himself, being the cause of all possible or actual. Okay, so here's what I'm trying to say here. I'm just borrowing from men who have gone before us. God knows all things in virtue of knowing himself, and that's because God is the cause of all things, all right? Now, there is this principle of thought called the principle of proportionate causality, which I believe I've alluded to this before, if it wasn't even, maybe even in the last episode. The principle of proportionate causality states that the cause, any given cause, must, in some sense, have the effect in itself. One example I used in one of the articles I wrote was that an architect can cause or bring about a set of blueprints. but those blueprints, or those plans, if you will, exist first in the architect's mind. So the architect has the potential, the capacity to bring about the particular effect of blueprints or plans to a house by virtue of that architect having it in some sense in himself, in his mind virtually, we could say. A firefighter has the potential to knock down a door with an axe. And he has that. If he has an axe, he has that efficiently. He has the cause, the direct capacity to break down the door with an axe, because he's got the axe. He's got the effect in himself in some way. So he's got the axe, and he's got the means by which he could break down the door, right? That's not the best analogy. I think the one with the architect is a little bit better, because it kind of is. It's a better analogy of God's decree. If God's decree are plans, really, is a set of blueprints, basically. So that's what we're saying when we say that God knows all possible futures. That God knows all. That God is the cause of all things, and He knows all possible futures in virtue of knowing Himself, and that's because He's the cause of all things, right? So if He knows Himself perfectly, if He knows Himself exhaustively, His own essence, then He knows everything that He could bring about, every effect He could bring about, and He knows it imminently, and perfectly. Okay, so let me try to summarize that one more time. God is the cause of all things, and because God is the cause of all things, He knows all things, knowing Himself perfectly and exhaustively. Okay, so if God knows Himself perfectly and exhaustively, then He knows all of His effects. All right, there. I have said it once for all. All right. Romans 9:11 through 18 plainly declares that God's works are based in God, not creatures or foreknown creaturely events. And we could look it up right now. Romans 9. Go to Romans 9. And that's going to be starting in verse 11, and I will read to verse 18. It says this: For the children being, and he's talking about, I believe he's talking about, for the children being done, I believe he's talking about Jacob and Esau. For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth, that is God. It was said unto her, The elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? God forbid. For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that shows mercy. For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, Even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he hardeneth. So God's doing, God's acting, God's knowledge, all depends on God. It doesn't depend on things external to himself. It doesn't depend on the man that wills or the man that runs, but on God, who, in that context, who has mercy and salvation. So that's kind of a brief exposition, and I say brief, I don't say that lightly, it really was brief. It was a brief exposition on paragraph 2 of chapter 3 of God's decree. Now what I want to move into, quickly before we end, we have about 6 minutes to do this, I want to move into middle knowledge, the concept of middle knowledge, because the implication of this paragraph is that God does not have middle knowledge. Okay. Actually, the implication of the first chapter with the simplicity of God, the divine essence, and with the implication of this, God does not have middle knowledge. So first of all, we have to know what middle knowledge is before we can say that God doesn't have it. So middle knowledge is that category in God's knowledge containing all creaturely counterfactuals. But now I have to define counterfactuals. And a counterfactual is this. It's an event brought about given a particular set of circumstances. Okay? But this kind of knowledge, so if God has this separate category of knowledge in himself, it's a dependent knowledge in that it depends on a particular set of circumstances in order for it to come to fruition, or in order for it to be true knowledge. Okay? And this makes it a separate category of God's knowledge, a real different category in God's knowledge. So it introduces composition into God, and as we saw in the previous episodes, in the first chapter, there can be no composition in God, because then God would not be God. All that is in God is God. All right, and so there cannot be composition in Him. And what middle knowledge does is it introduces contingency into God's knowledge, so it can no longer be necessary knowledge. It's contingent knowledge. It's knowledge dependent on the creature or creaturely circumstances in order to be true. And so it's a dependent knowledge, and therefore a truly separate category of knowledge. So not only do you have composition in God now, though, you have a category of knowledge in God that's now dependent. This is a dependent knowledge. In order for God to know event A, God knowing event A is only possible if a particular set of circumstances is possibly or potentially the case. And these are creaturely circumstances. So the creaturely circumstance must be the case for event A to come to fruition. So if God knows what Frank would do, he only knows what Frank would do given a particular set of circumstances. Okay? And that's dependent knowledge. It introduces contingency into the divine essence and therefore ought to be rejected. Not only does it violate divine simplicity, but it violates the doctrine of God's aseity, of his necessity, of his self-existence. It introduces dependence into God's being, and we can't have that. We can't allow that. So God does not know things by way of a middle knowledge, having no contingency in his being. So if there is no contingency, if there is no dependency in God, then God cannot have middle knowledge if middle knowledge is to be understood as a dependent form of knowledge. That is to say that God can only know A if a particular set of circumstances is the case. All right? And that seems to be what the broader view of middle knowledge is. Now, some will say, well, God has middle knowledge, but they're understanding it in a different way. They're just saying, well, God has all knowledge of possibilities. But we would say, well, that's not middle knowledge, really. That's just in God's necessary knowledge. Why not just recognize that as being part of, or not part of, or creaturely speaking, we're saying part of, as being inherent in God's necessary knowledge? Why not just recognize that fact? That why introduce a third form of knowledge in between God's natural and free knowledge, right? And by the way, the categories, natural, free, they're not really distinct. Those are just ways we talk about God's knowledge. They're ways we systematize the doctrine of God's knowledge. So they're not real distinctions in God. The problem, and the reason they're not, is because they're all grounded in God. The problem with middle knowledge is that middle knowledge relies on the creaturely in order to be true. And so that would be a separate category from God's natural and free knowledge, a truly separate category, a distinct category, a distinct way of knowing in God, a distinct mode of knowledge in God. that should be rejected because it violates or compromises the doctrine of divine simplicity, and it compromises the doctrine of God's necessity, or the fact that God is necessary being. So that's all we have. Actually, I'm surprised we made it through. With almost a minute to spare. So guys, thank you for joining. Please share this. If it benefited you in any way, please share this. Please like it. I appreciate your likes. I also really appreciate your feedback. I get messages and comments and things like that on my videos, and I really appreciate that. Some people will ask me to when I address a particular chapter or paragraph in the confession, hey, could you specifically address this issue that has implications on this particular doctrine? And I'm glad to get those kinds of requests and recommendations, because it helps me formulate my outlines. So God bless you guys. I hope you have a good rest of the day.